Okay, welcome. I'm sure we're going to have some folks that are joining us here. I see we got Tom is here with us, and of course Chris and Shannon, and then of course our guest today is Alban Brooke, who is the head of marketing with Buzzsprout. I've been fortunate to know Alban since 2014, and Alban, you have kind of seen it all because Buzzsprout has a really big community of users, and there are some people that are doing really well. There's some people who are starting out, and so in the mix of interacting and kind of seeing what works and what pain points some of the Buzzsprout users have, a lot of that is relevant for any podcaster. So. It's exciting today to have you on. Buzzsprout's been a tremendous supporter of podcast movement. We appreciate that. And then, we just wanted to kind of talk through some of those things that are happening for newer podcasters. And some of it, I must say that some of it may be contrarian to what, you may have heard or may have seen or may think. But I hope that you'll give us the benefit of the doubt, or give Alban the benefit of the doubt. But Alban, welcome. Is there anything that you want to add about yourself? You want to tell us a little bit about your role with Buzzsprout and kind of the things that are keeping you busy at the moment?
Sure. Um, yeah, so I'm the head of marketing at Buzzsprout. I've been in the podcast industry since you said 2014. I think the day I met you, Jared, was actually my first day.
Oh, was
Um,
it?
that
No
was the
kidding.
first day after I left law behind and I was like, I'm in the tech scene now. So that's when we first met. But yeah, I mean, we get to see all sorts of stuff from the brand new podcaster who has 3 listeners to now our current president, Joe Biden had his podcast with us. So you can kind of see like
That's
the full
amazing.
gamut of podcasters. And we get kind of we get behind the scenes with a lot of podcasts and we can see um, everyone's telling themselves a lot of stories about what makes a successful podcast, what you have to do. We see a lot of people come in and maybe they're selling something. So they kind of hype up that you need to be doing more than you have to. And
Mhm.
I don't know. So what I prepared today was if I could just give 10 tips, if I could give 10 tips, they're saying, here's the 20% of the work that if you do this, you get 80% of the results. We can improve on this later on, but these are the bases I want you to cover where you get the biggest bang for your buck. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. So yeah, I mean, there's no reason to hold back. Let's just kind of look at them. So,
All right. So first is we all hear this one is sound quality matters. And maybe it's not a surprise that it's like the podcasts who've been around for a while that mostly preach this to us. Maybe we hear this in a commercial for a new microphone or something. Um, Sound quality does matter. It's definitely important, but it doesn't mean if you have great sound quality, that doesn't mean people are going to listen to your podcast. They're listening for the content, and it's only when the sound quality is bad that people really notice it anyway. And so I want to just give like 3 quick pointers on sound quality. What can we do to get great quality sound without breaking the bank?
mhm.
Um, so, first off, USB microphones are definitely your friend. We really love the Samson Q2U. It's a directional microphone. It's dynamic, so it filters out so much background noise and it's great because it's $60. You don't need, I have the MV7 here. We have lots of expensive microphones around the office. They all sound great, but if you're getting to that $60 range, you're already getting 90% of the sound quality improvement from that mic. You don't have to go and spend $1,000. I remember being at a conference once, I gave a talk and someone said, I only have 10 grand for my studio. How should I spend it? And I was like, I think I would spend maybe $150 on your studio and I would save the rest of it and invest it or something. I don't know. That's a lot of money to be putting towards a microphone in a setup.
Well, if you're just over the top confident that you're going to be around and this is long term, then that could make sense. But I absolutely agree with you, Alvin. Why put forth a lot of resources in the beginning when you don't even know if you're going to want to do this after 3 weeks, much less long term.
I
So.
remember a mechanic telling me this. He was like, everyone, when they start working on their car, they go, the thing holding me back is I've got to buy a bunch of Snap-on tools. And so they go out and they can spend $10,000 on tools. He's like, go and buy the worst, cheapest tools you can get. He's like, and then when one breaks, then you have permission to go upgrade that one tool to anything you want, the highest level you want. He's like, but you've got to break it first. And I kind of like thinking about it with the microphone that way. Like, get the $60 Samsung Q2U and use it until you go, this is ready for an upgrade. And then you'll know so much more because you'll be a year into podcasting. You'll know exactly what you want rather than buying something that looked cool when you started, but then you later realized didn't fit your workflow.
Totally. And we've seen this in the Facebook group for Podcast Movement, and I'm sure you've seen this with new users and stuff. But there are some who will start out with a free hosting option, and then they'll do a few episodes and they realize, okay, now I don't want to be married or locked in long term with this particular platform. I want to move up to something like Buzzsprout or some of the other hosts that are out there. What are some things you see for people that make that decision and then they find themselves, okay, I'm now going to make a change?
Sure. I mean, I think opportunities for people to use things like Anchor or the free plan on Buzzsprout are awesome because we're just trying to lower the barrier to entry so that people can decide, does this work for me? We're all different. And so some people, podcasting is perfect, while other people, it might be doing YouTube videos or writing a blog. Once you figure out it is working for you, then you can evaluate, okay, I think I want a nicer stats package.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'm going to go to Buzzsprout, which has a better stats package, or I want to be able to do, easier interviews with guests. So maybe I'll get a subscription to Squadcast so that I get high quality interviews. There's nothing wrong with starting out free tier for everything until this is what I want to do long term. So that's why we have a free plan for Buzzsprout.
Yeah, makes sense.
The next thing for sound quality is your recording environment matters so much more than you anticipate. So if you've got a good microphone, but you're in an echoey room with a lot of reverb, it's still not going to sound great. And so in most homes, the best place to record is right in front of your closet or in a walk-in closet. You've got tons of clothes to soak up the sound, and that actually will make you sound so much better than almost anywhere else in your house. So that's kind of a quick tip. And we use it all the time when we do interviews. People are like, the sound's not great. We're like, hop over near the closet, and that will really improve the sound quality.
Yeah, I've seen friends of the podcast movement community. Alicia Butler's one. There's some others that they've actually taken a picture of their setup in their closet, and they put it out. And when you look at it, you're like, "Oh, that's not that glamorous. That's not that great." But their audio quality is really good, And it's like you don't know if it's just an audio only podcast, and who cares if you're in your closet? You just want it to sound nice. So
Yeah, well, we record some of our videos for Buzzsprout in closets, even though we have a studio and we're
yeah.
doing it. It is surprising how many people respond to the videos. Hey, you record in your closet too? Because it's such a great place to do it.
Yeah.
And you're quiet, you're away from maybe family, you get great sound. And we're not trying to be glamorous. We all don't know. Very few people have studios in their house. It's kind of a silly thing to do unless you're a professional podcaster. But if it's good enough for Ira Glass to record in his closet, it's good enough for all of us.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, there is no shame in the closet. Go ahead. Go ahead and do that.
All right. So second tip for directories. There's so many directories and lots of new ones coming out. But if we look at where the plays are actually happening and how people find podcasts, you can really just start with 3 directories and get almost all of the benefit. So get your podcast into Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and then Google Podcasts. And once you've done those 3, then a lot of podcast apps will pick it up because they'll see it in the other directories and they'll find you. And most listeners are finding podcasts through those 3 ways: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Down the line, If you want to go through the process of submitting to a dozen other directories, those are all available to you. It's just in the beginning, we're trying to avoid overwhelming ourselves
Yeah.
more than we're really trying to make sure we get that last single podcast listener.
Absolutely. And if you're not really getting any listens on some of those platforms, it's just almost maybe this is an unfair word, but it's like a vanity metric almost. Okay, my show's on this platform, but really nobody's listening. So you probably are better, being on Spotify and Apple and just Google and going with that.
Yeah.
So and that's what and because you're with Buzzsprout and you see the analytics, that's what are the top three. That's what you're seeing.
Yeah, those are not only are they the top 3, but they also feed. So Google Podcasts, those are open on the web, so they show up in search results, so people find it other ways. You also have Apple Podcasts, which they allow a lot of apps to find podcasts in their directory. So there's lots of apps. The minute you're in Apple Podcast, you're going to show up in Overcast and Castbox and Player FM. A lot of these other apps are already checking Apple anyway. So it could maybe be redundant, especially in the beginning, for you to go and submit everywhere.
Right.
So
I mean, there's that shiny object syndrome, Alvin, where people are saying, "Oh, I got to be on Alexa, Amazon Alexa, or I've got to be on all these, these 15 million places." It's kind of almost refreshing, but also contrary to hear, okay, well, I only need to focus on the 3 initially, but I see the point, because there are so many moving pieces in starting a podcast. It can be overwhelming if you don't just kind of, limit yourself and just say, okay, I'm going to just start here.
And none of this is to say it's not valuable to get into Apple or into Amazon Music, because it is. And it's valuable to get listed in Player FM directly. All of these things are good, but we're just trying to say, what are the first things you want to check off so that you can like relax a little bit and go, okay, I kind of covered my bases on the big things. I know I'm not missing anything massive. So now I can kind of focus on the show again, rather than going down a rabbit hole where I spent a week submitting to directories and that actually burned me out. So now I don't even want to podcast anymore. And you laugh, but it definitely happens.
I'm sure.
The next tip I wanted to talk about, it's kind of going with that theme of overwhelm. We can start off podcasting and we have these ideas of what it's going to be. So I know a lot of people here, John Lee Dumas has a cool story that when he started, he went all in, full-time job. Every day he was releasing a new episode. And while it worked incredibly well for him because that was what he was doing full-time, it burns out so many podcasters who think the only way for me to launch is actually to be doing 2 episodes a week, 5 episodes a week. I'm going to do all sorts of content. But a lot of really good podcasters, they say, I'm going to do 1 a week. Maybe I'll do every other week. I'll commit for a couple months. If you do this bit smaller and you don't overwhelm yourself, you're much more likely, it's a marathon, not a sprint, I guess is how I should say it. And so if you can stick with it, you're going to learn over time. You don't actually have to, release multiple episodes a week.
One of the people in the chat said that that Buzzsprout actually automatically distributes podcasts to big directories and many others. Do you want to mention that? Or
yeah, sure.
I'm sure that's true for a lot of hosts as well.
Yeah, you just need to submit once to each directory. And once you do that, everything after that is automatic. So with Buzzsprout, you'd go through, you'd submit to Apple Podcasts. Each subsequent episode will go there automatically. The same is true for every directory. And you only have to do it once. But again, don't feel this like compulsion, like I have to check every single box before I can move on. It's okay if you do the 3 big ones and then you come back later to kind of check those boxes, maybe in a month or 2.
I want to talk about the what you just said with, maybe not doing 5 a week and doing, maybe 1 a week or 1 every other week. Do you like the idea of like a seasonal approach? What's your opinion on that?
It's very dependent on what type of content we're talking about. So the way I see it is if you're doing anything that's topical, especially if you're saying, here's what's happening in my industry, here's what I find enjoyable about a sports team, then you need to be podcasting every week. But if you're going to put together, and I guess I have a good example for this, we did a season where we did, I think, like 10 episodes on how to start a podcast. Well, we did that. We recorded, edited everything that in a full month, and then we released it in the wild. And years later, it's still getting thousands of downloads a month. Um, and we just put it out as a season. But
Right.
personally, I enjoy kind of just that weekly check-in with your listeners, where you're kind of going on a journey and building a community with them. So it just depends on the type of content you're producing.
But you did say something before we hit record that resonated with me, and you kind of touched on it here, was the idea of not overwhelming yourself. So it could make sense to just say, okay, I'm going to try this for however many episodes. Let's say the number's 10, or this period of time for 3 months. Then I'm going to evaluate where I'm at. So that may not be the seasonal approach, but that is in a way a nice number or a nice time frame to discern whether or not podcasting is something that you want to do beyond just for that time period or those episodes.
Yeah, one of the stats that I think I quoted to you was right now in Apple Podcasts, there's 1.9 million podcasts. By the way, Jared, when we first met in 2014, there was less than 100,000. I remember when we crossed that mark, and it's been very quick that it's grown this fast, and it will continue to grow. We're not at the end of podcasting. We're still relatively young, but 1.9 million podcasts. And that feels like a lot. It goes, how is my little show going to get recognized in this sea of podcasts? Until you look a little deeper. If you actually just say, let me see only podcasts that have put out 10 episodes and they're still podcasting now, meaning they've done something within the last 3 months. So that feels like a pretty low bar. With just that bar, we drop 80% of the podcasts drop out, and we're left with 393,000 because very few podcasts make it to 10 episodes and very few of them stick with it. And so if you can commit, I'm not 100% sure if this is going to work for me, but I'm just going to do one a week for 3 months. You're going to end up with 12 episodes. You're going to be in that top tier. And then you'll have a feel for, is this working? And your show will already start to stand out a little bit.
Yeah. We had a question from Lori Ann. It applies, I think. She's saying, if you change the name of your podcast, you have to resubmit to these directories. And
yeah, not at all.
I think I know the answer to this, but yeah, no, the answer is no. Is the original submission would just apply that change, and the change would reflect in the directories, right?
Yeah. So we've done this when we've rebranded a handful of our own podcasts that we produce. But if you want to change the artwork, you want to change the title, you want to change the podcast completely, you can do that. And all of your subscribers will be subscribed. Now, you don't want to change it so drastically that you used to talk about a football team and now you're talking about marketing. And then in the future, you put like church sermons there. You don't want to change it that much. But if you decide, that's one of the reasons to say don't ever get hung up on your artwork or your title in the beginning, is because chances are that will not be your title forever. You started off with one number and then very quickly, or one name, and then very quickly you go, someone says, oh, this is a good name. And you're like, oh, that's actually better. I'm just going to switch it. No big deal.
Podcasters directory says in the chat, and this is really interesting. I don't know if these stats are completely accurate. They may, I'm assuming they are, but 1.9 million podcasts relative to 300 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. Almost 5 billion videos are watched on YouTube every single day. And that's not even talking about countless blogs that are out there that are may or may not be active. But you're saying just the active podcasts are less than 400,000. So that's a pretty, that's still a pretty good way to get noticed. Versus millions and millions or billions of videos.
If you look at just the number of blogs, YouTube channels, and podcasts, for every podcast, there's something like 27 YouTube channels.
Oh, wow.
So imagine like which of these worlds do you want to go into and compete in? Let's say you're a dog breeder and you love golden doodles and you want to do some content about golden doodles to help your business. Do you want to start a podcast and talk about them? And there's only one other podcast about it, or a YouTube channel and there's 27 who are already doing this, or an Instagram account where there's 600 who are doing the same thing. And if you're like, you just give me those numbers and I'm going to go, I think I can win the podcast. I might be able to be the best podcast in my space. And knowing the numbers, if I just stick it out for 3 months, the other one that's there will probably drop out anyway. And now I have it all to myself. So I become the place and I'm able to get all the interviews I want and make all the connections. All of that value. It's really great when you just have almost no competition.
There are some questions that are piling about this. Let's keep going, and we'll come back to them. So let's keep on with our list here.
Sure. So when we talk about promotion, often you hear social media is the number one thing to do. Social media has its place, but you want to be engaging with social media in the way that format dictates. If you're on LinkedIn, you need to be a little bit more professional. You want to write a little bit more long form. If it's Twitter, it's a lot shorter of a format. If you're on TikTok, you're doing kind of funny videos. And what people do sometimes is they tell themselves, I have to be everywhere. So they go and register 30 different social media platforms and they add all those apps to their phone. And then they write one piece of content and they try to go publish it everywhere. Instead, I say, go ahead and just pick one and pick the one that you already like, especially if you already know that your potential listeners are there. So for me, I like Twitter. That's where I should be. But if your podcast does a lot of it talks about something that's visual, maybe you want to pair it with your Golden Doodle podcast, maybe do start a little Instagram account. And that's where you share photos of the dogs, but also with the waveform of your podcast to get people to the podcast. But don't overload yourself with 30 things that you have to do, or else you'll never promote. And you'll never learn how to promote on that platform. It's so much better to double and triple down on one, especially when you enjoy, instead of trying to do everything.
And I think just to give some context here, you're really pointing this more towards someone who's a newer podcaster, someone who's a veteran who's got all these workflows and processes in place already. They may be able to manage, being on multiple channels better than someone who's new and may be feeling overwhelmed by all the different things that they think they have to do. So you're saying, hey, instead of worrying about all these channels, just focus on the one for now and build that, which I think is great advice.
Once you are the best place to get to is when your podcast, you can actually see how it's making you money. It may be direct monetization that you're being paid for ads. It may be through affiliate marketing. It may be that you're connecting with potential clients for your business. You might be selling a course. When that stuff starts happening and you go, I put work in and money comes back, and you see the value. I mean, for some people, it's becoming known as an expert. And so you get a bunch of job offers. It doesn't always have to be direct money. When that starts happening, well, then you can say, I'm actually tired of doing all this editing. I'm going to outsource that. Formatting things for Twitter and Instagram are not my cup of tea. I'm just going to outsource that to a social media manager. And then you could start branching out into all this extra stuff. But in the beginning, when it's just you and you also have a job and a family and friends, and you're also trying to get in shape, it's too much to put on yourself this 45 step podcast launch checklist. Give yourself 2. You publish the episode and you promote it once on your favorite social media, and then you're done. You don't have to do everything.
Amen. I agree with that. All right. So let's keep going here. We're doing great.
So one thing I love talking about, especially when we're looking at YouTube, podcasting, blogs, all these different platforms, we're always trying to bring it. It's not about audience size. It's about the value that you are getting and giving to your audience. It's the connection that you have with your audience. And so, the kind of fake math equation I want to give you is that value and that connection, it's worth the size of your audience multiplied by the level of connection, the depth of the relationship. So we will put the same stuff up on our YouTube channel where like we have I think our channel's doing pretty well. In about a year, we've grown it to 50 something thousand subscribers. And you can see that number go, that's a lot. And that's a lot more than a podcast I've ever done. But I know that on YouTube, almost none of them actually watch all our videos. Very few. It's only maybe like 2,000 of those 56,000 ever watch all of them. And when they do, the average watch time is something like 2.5 minutes. Well, now I go over to my podcasts and I start looking at those numbers. Well, now I know my podcast, which has the exact same content, Jared. I'm not like we film it once and we use the audio on a podcast. So it's the same content. The podcast gets between 2,000 and 3,000 downloads per episode. So it's actually more people are engaging than on YouTube, and it's easier. And they come back week after week. And when you go into Apple Podcast Analytics, you can see people are listening to the entire thing, 45 minutes. So now when I stack those against each other, I go, well, the numbers look a little more impressive on YouTube. But over on podcasting, those are people who actually care about me, who remember the hosts, who are engaged with the topic. And I can tell you, whenever I've gone to Podcast Movement and people come up and say, oh my gosh, you taught me how to podcast. It is always people who listen to our episodes. It's never people who watched YouTube. It's rarely people who read our blogs, even though those are much larger of an audience. It's the engagement. The thing that actually gets people excited to come up and talk to us is that they listen to us for something like 5 hours of a course through a podcast. It's so much more intimate and it's a much deeper connection. So yeah, when you see these numbers that may be, I'm only getting 20, 30 downloads per episode. That's actually pretty good because that's 20, 30 people who are coming back week after week and listening to you and really connecting with your message.
Yep. No, that's pretty cool. And I wanted to touch on something real quick. So you said when you're looking at podcasting, you're actually going into Apple to look at the analytics that Apple provides.
Right. So there's very few ways to actually see the amount of time people listened to a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Most podcast hosts can tell you the download numbers, and we can tell you how long someone listened on the embed players, but we can't tell you in apps. Luckily, Apple, Spotify, and Google all provide this data to us. So you can log into their individual platforms and see how long did somebody listen. And when you go do that, what that's providing you is just like a snapshot. It's not the entire audience, but it's saying about how long are people listening to my podcast. And it's consistently people are listening to almost the entire thing. And that's just so much more of a connection than 2.5 minutes. Maybe they're like tired on a Saturday and they're just flipping through YouTube for hours. It's much better for you to be somebody to be out for a run or doing dishes or, working in the garden or whatever it may be and listening to your podcast for 45 minutes. It's much more powerful.
Yep. Agreed.
All right. So we ready to wrap it up with a couple more tips?
Yeah, let's keep going. Then we'll address some questions.
So I always recommend you want to be plugged in with a community of people who are also podcasting. It's hard because not a ton of people are doing it right now. It's still relatively early. And so if you're trying to figure out what's the best editing workflow, you want to be plugged into a Facebook group or maybe a private community or some way, or maybe once COVID's over, a in-person community where you're connecting with people and you're able to bounce ideas off back and forth. people who understand what it's like when you work really hard for an interview and the person just doesn't show up, or something goes wrong with the recording software. So find a community and plug into it. Don't feel like you have to try a ton out. Just find one, and the one you're using, that's a great place for you to be. And then the last one is, don't be afraid to publish an episode. So I've met people. I remember back in the very beginning of when I started podcasting, 2014, people are starting and they're saying, I'm just polishing up these episodes. And I went, okay, cool. He's going to be launching. These sound like some really cool interviews. And then I met the same guy a few months later, and then a full year later at the same conference. And then again, another year later, every time I'd be like, oh man, how's the podcast going? I'm working. I've got a couple more interviews. I'm polishing up some more stuff. And I remember thinking, like, this poor guy, if he'd have just launched, it didn't matter what they sounded like 2 years ago.
Mhm.
And he'd just been like, I'm just going to put something out every other week. Well, after 2 years, he'd have 52 episodes. He'd have learned so much. He'd have refined this process, and he would have been an expert in the field rather than somebody who is almost like crippling levels of perfectionism. You know, go back and listen to your favorite podcaster. Go back to their very first episode.
Mhm.
It will not sound good unless they work for NPR
Yeah.
or they have previous podcasting experience. It will not sound good. And then you have to say, I just need to get into that ballpark. I don't even need to get to that level. Just start and start putting stuff out there. You will get better remarkably fast. So don't be afraid to publish.
That's painful to hear that that person took 2 years and oh, but that is a that is a common story. I've met people that have said similar things. So yes, please. Actually, there's a message in the chat. Send that person a Nike T-shirt that says "Just do it," and I think that's pretty good advice. Go ahead
I
and watch and allow yourself the grace to figure out what you don't know in those few episodes starting out.
imagine if you met someone who was a potential athlete and they spent all their time talking about which were the best running shoes. Okay, I need running shoes, but also like what are the best pants and like what shirt wicks sweat faster. And like they have all these different optimizations and they're never running races.
Hmm.
Well, you would not expect them to get any better. And in 2 years, it didn't matter what gear they bought, it mattered whether or not they just did it and they started running. And a lot of the best runners in the world didn't grow up with a ton of perfect gear. They grew up and they just had a love for it and they just did it. And then over time, then the gear came later. And so think of podcasting the same way. You just got to start doing it. And if it's not perfect, it's not perfect. You can always change the name. You can change the artwork. You can delete that old bad episode once you have 10 new ones. All of this can be changed. You will get better, but don't let yourself, if this is your dream, this is what you feel like you should be doing. Well, don't let yourself be held back because my mother-in-law is going to kind of make fun of it. My brother's going to say, oh, I mean, I felt this with podcasts. People from college who I didn't really like will probably see this and think, who does he think he is? He doesn't know anything. He's an idiot. I knew him in college. He was dumb. Like they see me and think I'm imagining they'll think that about me and going, I'm not going to put this out till it's perfect. Well, they're not even listening anyway. No one. So like how that was such a funny fear for me to have for so long. It shouldn't be holding me back from pursuing something that I personally want to do for me.
I've been podcasting since 2013, and it is so true. In that first year, I was so, it's like desperate is pretty much the fair word. I wanted so badly for people to listen that I just please listen. And now I'm at a point where it's like, hey, it'd be great if you listen, no worries. And now, so when people come to me and be like, oh man, I checked out your show and it's really good, or they make some kind of positive comment, I'm grateful. But at the same time, I don't, it's almost like I'm numb. Like I don't need it as bad. So
Yeah.
it's just like, hey, thanks. I appreciate that. But before I would have been like, begging these people to listen. And sometimes in most cases that wouldn't happen right out of the gate. But now, more people have I guess seen the longevity and the, just being diligent, and then people are like, "Hey, I should check that out," and they finally do, and then they message you, and it's like I got a message, Alban, from someone in Singapore that was talking about how they went on like this road trip, and they listened to the podcast for multiple hours, and I remember just kind of laughing about that, thinking, I have trouble getting my wife to listen to me for a couple hours, much less, much less, someone listening on a podcast. I almost felt like I should apologize, but it is pretty cool, and the people that are willing to kind of play that long game and do this, I think, yeah, unless they're just making a lot of mistakes, they're probably going to see opportunities from it. So
What's so powerful is by putting it out into the world, you're not asking people, I guess you're making available for anyone to opt in to listening to what you have to say. You're not demanding a conversation. The minute they don't like it, they can just turn it off. And so where like it would could get draining to listen to somebody for 2 hours. Well, when they're in the moment where they're on a long road trip, they go, "Hey, this is actually great stuff. I'm gonna just go ahead and download 12 episodes and just listen to them back to back." Let
I've
people
done
opt
that.
into that.
Yeah, I've done that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Alvin. We'll jump to some questions here. This is one from earlier from Lori Ann. I think this is a good one. It kind of goes back to the conversation about YouTube and podcasts. But what do you think about YouTube versus podcast stations regarding stats? And then she says, we promote the podcast mostly, although we have a YouTube where all the videos are uploaded. If we direct people to the video, it lowers our download stats. What do you recommend? Do you promote both? You kind of touched on this a little bit. So what's the advice there for someone who's doing both?
So I, no joke, had a meeting, like a 4-hour meeting with our content team yesterday where we talked, at least part of it was about this strategy. We do a lot of content on YouTube, and a lot of that also gets repurposed as podcast episodes.
Mhm.
Podcasts are really good for when people are committed to you and getting them to come back week after week after week. But it is so difficult to grow a podcast. It is so much more difficult than YouTube, where you put up a video and YouTube all of a sudden randomly you'll get a video up and all of a sudden it's getting 1,000 downloads a day and you're not doing anything. New downloads. And then all these subscribers start coming in. You're going, whoa, this is kind of crazy. And YouTube has that power because they have an algorithm driving new views. And the same thing works on Twitter and on LinkedIn and now on Clubhouse and all these other places. They bring new people to you.
Yeah.
What the deal that you make with these platforms is the minute that your content does not fit perfectly with their goal, then you're not in their plans in the future. And so for some people, this has meant like being demonetized or kicked off the platform, but I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about people who they were doing short videos for YouTube, and then YouTube started prioritizing longer form content. Or maybe you were talking about the news and current events a lot, but then you found out that a lot of advertisers were worried about misinformation. So they just said no news content. Maybe your content was great, but you kind of got caught up in that ban. And so there's tons of good reasons why platforms, I mean, for a long time, Facebook, they would push people going live over anything else. And so people dedicated this entire period of their marketing strategy to going live. And now they don't get close to the reach that they used to. So I love using these platforms. And whenever I get attention, then I say, and subscribe to the podcast. I'm always encouraging people to move there because podcasts, blogs, and email newsletter, those are the only 3 open source platforms that you control that are not about an algorithm deciding whether or not you have the content that's popular today. So what we do, I guess this is the answer. What we do is we direct everyone to YouTube and we try to get those videos to perform well. And then we always encourage people from the videos to subscribe to the podcast, to read the blog on our website, or to sign up for our email newsletter, because we always want to direct people back to the content that we control that's not controlled by the algorithm.
That's well said. Before I get to some of the questions that are in the chat, if you want to ask a question for Alban, we encourage that. You can type it in the chat, or you can actually, there's a way to raise your hand. And Shannon on our team is with us here. She can potentially allow you temporarily to come on live. Looks like Tom has a question, but we can have you queue up and come on live with Alban and ask your question via audio or video. So there's a few ways that you can ask your question in the chat or raise your hand, and then we'll attempt to bring you up. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for Tom to potentially join us, we'll just hit on this one real quick. This is from Columbus's iPhone. So I don't know who Columbus's iPhone is, but their question is, I'm launching my first podcast show in April 1st, and I've heard a lot of good things about Buzzsprout. How do I determine which podcast host works for me? So what do you say to people who are kind of weighing those out?
Yeah. So I obviously am biased. I think that Buzzsprout is the best and the easiest way to get your podcast online. You can go and sign up for a few different hosts just to get a feel for whether or not the UI looks like something that's going to be easy for you to use. You could try uploading an episode to both if you want to test them out. The main things that I think are important are, you want a host that's removing as much of the complexity as possible, because you're already dealing with, how do I write a great script? How do I get a good interview? How do I edit? And then when we're publishing, you just want a lot of that removed. And so that's our complete focus at Buzzsprout. We started off helping nonprofits get online. And the whole thing with nonprofits is, you get a lot of 18-year-olds who donate 50 hours of time right before they go to college, so they can get that on their resume. Mm-hmm. And then when they leave, you go, hey, well, that kid just set up the podcast, but now no one knows how to use it. We had to make it like so easy that if you had no experience with podcasting, you could jump in and get a podcast up quickly. Or if somebody else set it up, you could continue uploading. So that's how, our focus with Buzzsprout. But the last thing is, you can always move. If you start off on a platform and it doesn't work for you, all the major podcast hosts allow you to redirect your feed. So if you start with us and then you want to go to Captivate, and then maybe you think Libsyn looks better to you, it works out perfect that you're able to move around. So you're never locked in.
That makes sense. Well said. Let's see if we get Tom up here. Shannon, can you allow Tom to join us?
I'm unmuted, and I could ask a question, or I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I can't start my video, so
okay, not a problem.
First of all, thank you. This is the first time I've ever joined one of these, and I've been podcasting for 5 years. I've produced podcasts for a number of different clients, and I have.
You're a veteran.
Yeah. And this is great. This is I wish I had a resource like this when I started.
Sure.
So Alban, I guess my question for you is, how do you feel about paid media campaigns to help grow an audience? I mean, I've had some varying degrees of success. I've never found the formula that works for audience development through Facebook posts or paid tweets or things like that. So I was wondering if you've heard of anyone that has been successful doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lots of different ways to try this, and I've probably tried almost all of them at some point. You can go the traditional way of, you're trying to do promoted things on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn and hoping to get people through to your podcast and subscribe. The drop-off rate there is so high that it's very, very expensive to get a listener. The way to do this right, there's two ways to do paid to get podcast listeners. I actually did probably like a 45-minute conversation on YouTube with Jordan Harbinger. So he gets something like 8 million downloads a month on the Jordan Harbinger podcast. And he's done a lot of this through paid ads. The two ways to do it. One is inside of apps. The ones I know of that do this: Overcast, Player FM, Castbox, I think Radio Public. They will all allow you to buy ads inside the app. And then those ads say like, hey, check out the Alban and Jared show. Here's where we talk about whatever, living in Florida. And you click it, and then you can subscribe right there. And because that ad is placed right next to the subscribe button, the numbers are so much better. So those are campaigns that I've run that have worked really well. When we did with Castbox, I think we got something like immediately we had an episode get 8,000 extra downloads.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
How much
great.
did that cost, Alban? Are you allowed to say, or?
Yeah, we spent $2,500 with Castbox.
Okay.
Got 8,000 more downloads for episodes immediately. And then that tapered down to about 1,000 extra listeners long term. But $2,500 for 1,000 people to continue listening to the podcast for hopefully for years, and then they will tell more and more people, it are really great numbers.
Versus spending Google ads, Facebook ads, things like that.
Which I've never seen anybody make that work. Not in 6.5 years of podcasting.
Yeah, the only way that we were able to make it work is to convert them to subscribers to a blog and hope that they were going to listen to the podcast.
Right.
They never did, and it was money down the drain for most of my clients.
Well, that's
Great. Thank you.
That's encouraging to hear about the player apps being able to offer that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. You shared both ways. Was it? I know that you shared one.
Yeah, and the other one, and this is what Jordan Harbinger does, is going on other podcasts and buying ads for your podcast.
So he's not necessarily being a guest on their show. He's paying a podcaster to run an ad on his behalf or something for his
right
show.
Now, Jordan Harbinger, a lot of big podcasts know that podcast ads are way undervalued, and having a big show allows you to get better interviews. So he's able to leverage like, hey, I'm getting 8 million downloads a month. And they go, oh, well, now he can get interviews like General H.R. McMaster and Kobe Bryant and Dennis Rodman have all been on his podcast. So you start getting some of these big names, and then you attract more listeners. And so it kind of spirals. So he uses the money he's making from the podcast to buy ads on other podcasts and say, if you love great interviews, like interviews with these people, come listen to my podcast.
That's good.
And the reason those strategies work more than the other ones is because you need to be talking to people who already have a podcast app on their phone. You can't be the one trying to convince them. Click on this link, go to a website, download an app, click on my podcast, subscribe to the show. That many steps, it's so difficult to try to get listeners that way.
I don't know if Jordan touched on this. Maybe people just go check out that YouTube video that you did with him. But how is he approaching podcasts to say, hey, I want to spend money on your show as an ad? Because if someone doesn't know you, or you know what I mean, that could maybe trying to figure out what's the best practice for that.
He uses an agency that's buying ads. So I'll drop here's the link to the YouTube video where I did that interview.
Okay.
What he's doing, he's using an agency just the same way that MailChimp and Squarespace are reaching out to podcasts.
Okay.
Except they're saying, instead of talking about starting a website with Squarespace, just talk about, hey, there's a cool podcast with Jordan Harbinger over here. And I know that if you do have a significant budget, I know that he I think has an agency now himself that's doing it, but this is up in the thousands of dollars a month range.
Yeah,
so
if you're further along, so like a business that has a marketing budget to do that would make sense. So a hobbyist, most likely not. So
right.
That makes sense. There's a question in the chat. This is from John. He said he just entered, but he's curious about if Buzzsprout has any editing plans for newbies to podcasting. So I know you guys have some free trials and some things. What are some of the newer tiers that are probably a better way for a new person to get started?
So if you want to just start editing, I would either go one of two routes. Audacity is where almost everybody starts. It's free, it's open source, and there are just an incredible amount of tutorials on YouTube. And so you can download Audacity for free and then start editing there. If you want something super basic that's very easy to use, there's a really good app called Alitu, and you can put your audio in there, clip, add segments together, and then export it. And they actually integrate with Buzzsprout, so you can send it right over to Buzzsprout. We don't have plans ourselves for creating editing inside of Buzzsprout right now. We have recently launched a feature where you can add dynamic content to your episodes. So let's say you want to add an ad, if you want to add an advertisement to all of your podcasts, you can do that all at once. So that's kind of a light editing. We have no plans to add editing into the app right now.
That makes sense. Okay, fair enough. And another question that came up. Let's see. We have. Okay, this is. What are some of the top reasons that you've seen that attribute to pod fading, meaning someone stops their podcast?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably guess one of my answers from the tips is going to be being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Lots of times podcasters have this sense you've been told from the different groups you're in, from people that are trying to sell you something, people that are giving you a checklist with 45 items, that you have to do all this stuff to be successful. In the beginning, you're just trying to get into a habit. I think habits are a good way of thinking of it. When we're trying to start a habit, we start really small, and then you make sure you get that habit going before you make it something massive. And so the same with podcasting, just don't overwhelm yourself by saying you have to do lots of episodes all at once, that you have to push it to 40 social media platforms. Just limit the amount of work you have to do in the beginning. Another one is people get discouraged by the download numbers. So I love this story that a friend told me. He worked out for a long time on his podcasting conference, and he was like, he spent weeks preparing, and it was like a 1-day small event. And then afterward, he talked to somebody, and the guy goes, "Yeah, but I'm shutting my podcast down." And he goes, "Why?" He goes, "Oh, it's only getting 300 listens." And he goes, "Wait." And it kind of clicked in his mind that somebody was spending 2 hours a week putting together a podcast episode and was getting 300 downloads and wasn't happy. But he just spent 2 weeks to get people to listen to him for about an hour. And he goes, "Well, wait, one of us is misunderstanding the math here. Like, one of us is doing way too much work." And he goes, "I think that I should be doing what you're doing, and I think you should keep doing what you're doing." So don't take your podcast numbers, I guess, and equate them to YouTube views, because they're nothing close to each other. It's more like if you had the opportunity to talk to people about something you cared about for an hour a week, and you only had to do an hour of prep before that, and it was only going to be 30 people in the room. They invited you to come speak to them. Would you go? And when I think about that, I go, of course I would. If people said, "Hey, we'd love to talk to you about marketing," I would show up every week and speak to, that small group of maybe 30 people. So in the beginning, you may be only getting 10, then 20, then 30 listeners. Well, that's great. If those are real people listening to you, that's a pretty big group. Imagine those as real people.
Yeah. If there was 300 people actually in front of you, you'd probably be unsettled. You might be nervous unless you're just like super good at speaking.
So on Friday, I have an episode. I was just on Pat Flynn's podcast, Smart Passive Income, and I think it comes out on Friday. And
Oh, congrats. That's a big show.
thank you. One of the things I was thinking, I was like, wait, he gets something like 80,000 downloads an episode or something unreal. And I was like, when I go to football games, the stadiums do not hold that many people. If you got me on the field of a football stadium and packed it out and then said, "Let's do an interview right here and everyone can hear it," I would be terrified and I wouldn't be able to handle it. But when it's just me sitting behind a computer talking to somebody, it just feels so much more natural. And so we actually have the benefit that we're talking to smaller audiences, because I know I would be just terrified to imagine that I was speaking to anything more than 4 or 5 people at a time.
All right. So Alban, we only have a couple minutes left. So I'm going to ask another question, then we'll wrap up and kind of find out where people can connect with you if they want to connect offline. The question is, you talked about finding the podcast community and kind of sticking with it. And I think podcast communities are a great thing. Obviously we have a one ourselves, and you do too. but sometimes there's mixed messages. Like there might be one voice that says, okay, you need to do this. And then there's another voice over here that says, well, no, you don't listen to him. Go do this. How do you discern, especially if you're new, how do you discern what advice is, um, relevant and what's actually going to be helpful if you're in a community?
Um, I'm always wary of people who teach rather than do.
Hmm.
So if you have two people who are telling you how to do something and only one of them is podcasting, well, then I would go with the person who's actually podcasting. There's people who have podcasting courses that don't have podcasts, which is very strange to me. If they're not doing it, then I wouldn't take their advice. And then if
That
somebody
seems
is
totally fair.
if
Yep.
somebody's selling has a if they present a problem to you and then immediately follow it up with how they will solve it for you if you give them money, that goes for me too. So I realize that, like, then also be wary that like maybe they're overhyping this problem to be able to sell something to you. And so I
Mm.
just, and then you kind of just look at the numbers. When you ask, like, what is everybody using for what's the best audio editing software? You'll get a lot of answers. But if you say, what audio software is everyone using? Then the overwhelming majority of people say, oh, I'm using Audacity. And so it's really interesting to just try to get what are people using? And that gives you a good feel for, well, why don't I start there? And later on, I will make the determination if I want to upgrade or switch or try something different.
Yeah. Um, we just had this question. This person unfortunately didn't get to see the whole thing, but they said, what is a huge energy and time waster for new podcasters? This is from John. John actually missed most of the presentation because you kind of touched on those things, but just in a summary, what are some things that new podcasters need to avoid
Oh,
from wasting their time?
I mean, we talked about trying to do everything on every social media platform, but the other one is perfecting your episodes. Like, we've got to get over it. We have to accept, like, podcast episodes have ums and ahs in them and they have false starts. And the way we talk is not the same as how we write. And so it won't sound perfect and crisp every time.
Mhm.
And so you can just let that be. You don't have to edit it because a lot of people are out for a run or they're doing something else and they're perfectly happy to listen to you. And they may not necessarily want the episode to be edited down by another 30 seconds so they can get the ums out of there. It may not even be all that valuable to them. And it, wasted a ton of your time. So that's one that I would say we can just let that go. We don't have to edit to perfection.
Alban, I really appreciate you being gracious and taking time to speak with the community and share these valuable tips. And I'm sure that some folks may have questions. If they want to reach out to you or stay connected with what you're doing, where can they do that?
Sure. So, Buzzsprout, we have tons of resources on buzzsprout.com.
Excellent
I'm
resources. Yep.
I'm on Twitter at Alban Brooke, and we are trying out Clubhouse tonight. So in I think an hour from now, I'll be on Clubhouse doing a podcasting Q&A there. So we're just going to be bringing people on stage and answering questions very similar to what we're doing here. And if anyone has a question that didn't get answered, then we'd invite them to come join us there.
And is that you personally on Clubhouse or is that the Buzzsprout Clubhouse account?
That is me. So I
Okay.
will
So Alban
go.
Brooke on Clubhouse.
Oh yeah. So I think the club is called Podcasting Q&A.
Okay.
But if they search, I think I'm Alban, Alban on Clubhouse. And then if you find me, you'll see that I'm the speaker for an event that starts in an hour.
Okay. Well, Alban, thank you again. We appreciate your generosity and just your desire to really genuinely help new podcasters and creatives. And Buzzsprout has just been tremendous support of podcast movement and a lot of podcasters. So thank you and thank you, Buzzsprout. And yeah, we wish you the best and good luck tonight on Clubhouse.
Thanks, Jared. Well, we always appreciate you and everything you've done, especially with podcast movement. It's great to have known you for all these years and hopefully for many more to come.
Absolutely. And for people that came in late and want to check out this, we're going to house this recording in Podcast Movement University. If you're not a member of that, you can check that out, university.podcastmovement.com. There's a free trial, so you're not having to be overwhelmed and feel like we're trying to hit you up. You can try the free trial and check out the replay with Alban. Alban, again, thank you, and look forward to talking to you again.
All right. See you, Jared. Thanks.
Thanks, man.